Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Well, all right, we'll do a show. Why not? It's Tuesday. Hi, everybody. How you doing? It is Tuesday, June 29th, 2021. Just by way of checking in and letting those of you know who are listening live that we are, in fact, doing it live today. Won't be the case tomorrow as I go in for oil change, I guess, essentially. Periodic maintenance, I guess you could call it. And 9 o'clock was the only appointment I could grab at any time that would actually work. And that doesn't work. So that tells you about, I guess, what the crush is like trying to get doctor's appointments. Just your regular basic checkup doctor's appointment. Post-COVID, everybody's finally going back now. So we'll miss you tomorrow. But today we have the whole day ahead of us. Isn't that nice? The Kagro in the Morning radio show is live now, I am informed, via Bill's morning tweet. Today, Kagro X, me, hi, how are you? I host the show. I take my instructions from Bill. And today I'll be testing the patience of my next-door neighbor, oh, that's probably true, by shooting increasingly larger fireworks through their kitchen window. We'll see what happens, but we'll only get an oblique angle on it, because, of course, we live in townhouses, so it's a difficult thing. I'm going to have to do this from outside. I can't do it from the convenience of my own windows. There's nothing facing their kitchen. I could probably shoot it into their kitchen through the walls. That's a possibility. And who knows? That could happen at any time around here with the strange mixture of townhouses and gun culture. Hooray! Okay. Well, at any rate, let's see. What have we to share with you today? Well, gosh, there's just so much going on. And this morning, I saw a very interesting tweet that really, I didn't think I would be thinking about this today, but some random thought must have occurred to somebody at some point. And they expressed it on Twitter, and you know what happens when someone does something like that. Let's see. This is Menshevik. Menshevik M is the Twitter handle here, though identifying currently as guerrilla warfare, as in gorilla, like the great ape guerrilla warfare. Any rate, our new friend Menshevik here says, out of the blue, I guess, I don't know what they've been talking about for the rest of the day, people didn't savor how funny Rex Tillerson's arc was. Something I didn't think about. Or haven't thought about for a while, and I read it this morning, and I thought, this is a good point. We in all the ridiculousness that happened in the Trump administration, all the terrible things, and we could catch up on some of those, by the way, today with our stories in pocket. People didn't think about or savor how funny Rex Tillerson's arc was. The man spent 40 years climbing the ladder at Exxon, one of the most cutthroat corporate cultures on earth, became CEO, and then blew it all up to spend a year thinking about how to make the Kim Jong-un Rocket Man tweet into policy. That's a really good point. I think it is rather underappreciated. And it's really kind of remarkable. We all knew it would likely be, or could likely be, a disaster for the United States to be represented at that high level by someone who had just come from being CEO of ExxonMobil. But what a strange move it was. And I don't know, I guess he probably thought this would be a real capstone on his legacy, whatever it was. If the CEOs of giant corporations can have legacies outside the corporation itself, and they can, of course, but I think it's a rare thing. You have to be one of the true giants of not only a giant in your industry, but a giant in a giant industry in order for that to happen. I don't know how many corporate CEOs really make it to that level. And I'm sure he thought, well, I'm perfectly positioned. Here a businessman has been elected to the White House. Of course, he was never any kind of a businessman. And on top of that, relations with Russia are going to be super important. And I have a good relationship with some of the top officials in Russia. But of course, he was coming from a completely different place and a different type of relationship with the people in Russia. And that ended up not figuring into it at all because, of course, the Trump administration spent certainly the first year or two of the administration trying to distance themselves from, well, I don't know if it's the right term. They didn't really try to distance themselves from Russia. They grew closer, of course, but publicly trying to disavow connections with Russia and the Russian oligarchs, but in the meantime taking their orders from them. But so there was really no place in the world for Rex Tillerson and his relationships, and instead it became his job to try to explain or build some sort of coherent program around Donald Trump's random angry tweets at Kim Jong-un, which then, of course, stood themselves on their head anyway, with or without Tillerson. But anyway, he was fired ignominiously probably via Twitter, the way everyone else was. And I don't think we were even halfway through the Trump administration before he was being quoted in tell-all books and interviews afterwards saying that Trump was an effing idiot, et cetera, et cetera. And even that didn't really break through because there were too many people saying that about Trump. And it didn't matter that Rex Tillerson was. I don't know what to say. What an arc, yes, and what a good observation, too. I didn't expect to be spending any time on that today, but I think that's a good thought out of the blue and kind of reminds us how about the danger of getting involved with Donald Trump and how everything Trump touches dies. I don't think there's a better illustration than that example, except for any other ones that you might be able to come up with in the next couple of minutes, and hashtag KITM and tweet to me on Twitter, and I'm sure I'll agree. Anyway, let's see. Other things. Let's get to what we had in store for all of you for us to share with you today, because there's an awful lot. This one I'll just share, I think, the headline. It's good, long-form, involved reporting from everyone's favorite, one of everyone's favorites, let's say, over at Mother Jones, David Korn, who reports under the headline, "Documents show Ivanka Trump didn't testify accurately in inauguration scandal case." Maybe you forgot that there was an inauguration scandal. It was only a minor scandal in the scheme of things from Trump world, but had to do with the Trump organization-owned hotel space in Washington, D.C. Essentially, I think, overcharging the Trump inaugural committee for space for inauguration events, which, like I said, in the grand scheme of things of Trump scandals, didn't really register with people because it was only Donald Trump using political organizations to steal money. That doesn't rise to even, above the median in terms of Trump scandals. But that's all it was. Using the fact that inaugural committees can raise enormous sums of money and aren't subject to normal reporting requirements and aren't subject to normal reporting requirements for disbursements of that cash. Much more requirement in terms of disclosing who donated than there are in terms of where the money went. And then essentially, of course, the president, who had run on the premise of my ownership of all of these various venues that can be used for official events, will actually save both my campaign and the government lots and lots of money because I can waive those fees because I already own those venues. Well, that got stood on its head immediately. It wasn't even sworn in for a matter of hours before he was already stealing money, just basically doubling and tripling the price of rentals of ballroom space at his own hotel for events that were parties for himself and his family. So I don't really know how the whole thing, I don't know how it came to pass, except that they realized, well, if we can raise millions of dollars in $1 million chunks from corporate donors and rich individual donors, etc., and then even though there's very few restrictions on how we spend the money and probably could have simply paid it directly to ourselves, we'll practice for defrauding campaign funds in the future by laundering it through our hotel. And instead, we will pay 3, 4, 5, 10 times the cost of renting a party hall for a party for ourselves, but thereby converting other people's money into our own. Anyway, it's a long article that would take quite some time to read through. I just will refer you to it. You can read it on your own time. It's really, I took a skim through the first half of it, and it doesn't appear to be revelatory. It wasn't relevant, but it was revelatory. But not quite enough, I think, to spend that much time on it, because, I don't think anybody is surprised that Ivanka Trump lied to cover up their theft in that situation. But if you're interested in the details of the emails that went back and forth, essentially it comes down to Ivanka Trump testifying in court that she really didn't have that much to do with the planning of inauguration events, and so therefore can't be held responsible for the mountains of evidence that make it perfectly clear that the Trump organization was jacking up its prices tremendously in order to skim more and more cash off of the inaugural committee and pocket it for themselves. But the claim was, I didn't know that much about it. I wasn't really dealing with that. And the claim of the article is, well, there are several emails that indicate that you actually had more involvement than you let on during your deposition, which brings us to a perjury problem and possibly something else, and pinning more of this responsibility on you. But ultimately, it just doesn't lead. I don't think it leads anywhere. Although up in New York, actually slightly disappointingly, we're finding that the prosecution of the Trump organization, as opposed to Donald Trump himself, continues apace. But it doesn't look like what they're doing at the moment lands Donald Trump in irons anywhere. But it does cut off a money supply, which may in itself make it possible or more possible to convict Trump of something personally later on if the money that would otherwise ordinarily pay for his legal defense begins to dry up. But it's a long walk. At any rate, just thought I would note that for the record. And perhaps if some of you are able to parse something out that deserves mention, please, by all means, drop us a line and tell us where we can find it and what your observations were, and we'd be happy to share them. Let's see. Other items worth pointing out. Yesterday we discussed briefly the news about Bill Barr and the revelations in the forthcoming, I guess, Jonathan Karl book that we'll all have to, some others of us will have to pay for and then digest and then publish in excerpts in the newspaper so that we can all learn 6 to 8 months, a year, 2 years after the fact, what important information we could have known, should have known, might have made a difference in either one of the two impeachments, etc., etc., what was made available to all these reporters who we would see daily on television, but who were saving it up for their book. But Greg Sargent took a look through all of this information yesterday and declared yesterday that the real news in William Barr's interview with John Karl is that Barr admitted that he greenlighted election fraud investigations, despite already concluding that there was zero basis for them. And we did get around to that in a roundabout sort of way, but this was stated nice and directly. That opens the door for a congressional probe of that decision, he writes, and provides a piece from yesterday that makes that case. But specifically, he goes on to embellish his thoughts on this on the Twitter thread, saying, in November, Barr reversed Department of Justice policy. This is kind of an important bit about that. In November of 2020, Barr reversed Justice Department policy against election fraud probes before certification. Remember that that was not something that the Department of Justice otherwise would ordinarily have gotten involved in. Too political, too close to the election, etc. But now, having done that already. Barr now, though, says that he knew all along that the fraud claims were all BS, and that means there was no predicate for that shift in DOJ policy, no matter which interpretation you adopt. Just keep that in mind every time we do things like, well, we didn't indict Trump or recommend that Trump be indicted or even recommend that he be impeached in the Mueller report because there's a DOJ policy that says you can't indict a sitting president, and that we won't dictate to Congress whether or not it should use its impeachment power, et cetera, et cetera. But these DOJ policies, in many cases, can be reversed with a simple decision at the top level, with the Attorney General backing a change in that policy, even if there is no legitimate reason for that policy. And in fact, every piece of evidence you've dug up hoping to find justification for that policy actually indicates the opposite path. Well, he's just an outcome-oriented guy. Straight shooter, that Bill Barr. It's a good point, I think. Barr now, he goes on to say, says McConnell privately told him that he knew Trump's lies were hurting the country, but Mitch's Georgia candidates supported the Texas lawsuit and the 1-6 objections to Biden's electors to keep Trump voters engaged. Mitch surely approved of both. All things that became obvious yesterday, but I like the way he strung those things together in one continuous thread. We could probably take a look at his piece from yesterday. It might be helpful, but perhaps we'll make our rounds first before deciding to dive back into this if necessary. William Barr's bombshell about Trump is more revealing than it seems. And I guess this is chiefly, I think, about Barr's having played along the whole time, even right up to his resignation letter, as being supportive of Trump's claims about voter fraud, only to be secretly telling Jonathan Karl at the time, and we only get to find that out now, that he thought the whole thing was BS from the start, but the country, now just suffering the consequences of it anyway. As a matter of fact, one of the things we're suffering the consequences of, something that Greg emailed or direct messaged to me via Twitter early this morning, something that we've been watching happen over the past couple of weeks, and Politico, I guess, just now either ready to admit it or reiterate it, I'm not sure which. Arizona ballot audit shows signs of backfiring on GOP. Independent voters, if you believe there are any, oppose the controversial recounting of ballots by a wide margin. Overall, I guess it's closer than you would want it to be, but it's still a majority of all voters actually disapprove of the conduct of this audit in Arizona, which is telling. And by the way, alongside it were poll results showing I think they tried to indicate that the lead was narrow, but it's actually pretty substantial. But a lead for a hypothetical, or a lead for Biden in a hypothetical rematch with Trump in 2024. Though at the same time, I guess the poll also notes that a small majority of people in Arizona actually think that Biden shouldn't run for re-election, which I guess is probably aimed at his age more than anything else. At any rate, most people in Arizona are pretty much rejecting the audit on its face, and lots of Republicans, even some who once backed it, are backing away from their backing of it as they recognize, A, what a disaster it is, B, how foolish they're going to look having taken so long, and all they're going to end up with is reconfirmation of prior biases, because the Cyber Ninjas CEO is a conspiracy theorist and was long before he was hired to conduct this so-called audit. And it's going to, I guess, attempt to throw things into confusion. But apparently right there in Arizona, they're already ready to discount the results of it. So I think that's kind of it's an interesting observation and something to look in on as well. Let's see. I wanted to share with you yesterday, but didn't get around to it. Daniel Dale, still around and fact-checking stuff, even though his main target has retreated to his golf resorts really for the rest of his life. These days, I think he is ensconced at the Bedminster, New Jersey club, and Pervalago Moss Isley is closed for the season. I think that's what's going on at the moment. And and yes, by the way, some of the articles that have come out over the past couple of weeks about Jared and Ivanka trying to distance themselves from Donald, noting that yes, for all the distancing that's going on, they have nearly adjoining cabanas at Bedminster. They're living, I guess, what they call cabanas. They got houses for themselves on the property, and they live next door to one another, and they see each other all the time. There's no distancing going on, and there never was. All right, let's see. As I said, Daniel Dale still out there and on the beat for CNN, doing fact-checking, and I guess he's got to cast about for other idiots to check facts on, and there are plenty. And they keep presenting themselves at every opportunity to him. This time, Madison Cawthorn, the 15-year-old idiot representing, North Carolina's, I think, 11th district. At any rate, I guess he stopped punching trees or videotaping himself punching trees for long enough to find himself on Daniel Dale's target list. Madison Cawthorn, self-described, quote, big history buff. He's not a big anything, of course. Keeps getting historical facts wrong. Well, he didn't say he was a buff of studying to get the things right. He just, history as a general subject. I really like getting history wrong, I guess, is a way of being a history buff. And I guess it was prompted by one of his latest floor appearances in which he made a major historical blunder. And, it's probably recounted here in this report. Madison Cawthorn, freshman Republican from North Carolina, has called himself a big history buff and a lover of history, but Cawthorn, who at age 25 is the youngest member of Congress, the youngest one we would allow, as a matter of fact, keeps getting historical facts wrong. Of course, almost everything happened before he was born, so you can't blame him. Cawthorn also has a record of other false claims, so not just historical ones. Here's a look, and that's a link, too, if you want to check into it, a link to, I'm kind of curious what they've compiled here. Let's see. Non-historical false claims, not about his own background, which we've read about and shared in the past, but other Daniel Dale pieces. This time, just FYI, it was a fact check on Cawthorn falsely claiming that there are $0 spent on homeless veterans. Of course, he was off by approximately $2 billion plus for that particular year alone, or I guess this year is what we're talking about. So, not very impressive in that respect. But that's not what we came here to read about. We wanted to hear about the historical blunders. Cawthorn, as he said, also has this record of other false claims. Here's a look at some of the inaccurate assertions he has made about the American past in particular. Here's the history stuff. Speaking on the House floor on Thursday, just last week, to criticize the Biden administration's handling of the economy, Cawthorn said, "It was Thomas Jefferson that said," and right away we already have a grammatical error here. It was Thomas Jefferson who said, but he says it was Thomas Jefferson that said, "Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence." Very eloquent sounding. The famous quote is, in fact, from John Adams, not Jefferson, so kind of like close but no cigar, I suppose. Cawthorn omitted two of Adams's words in the quote as well. And Adams uttered it in 1770 while serving as a defense lawyer for British soldiers who had been charged with the murders committed in the Boston Massacre. Yes, defund the British troops, I think, was the rallying cry at the time. Essentially police brutality early on here in the what would become the United States of America, the nascent United States. And I'm curious whether he even knew what the context was that in which Well, I guess he wouldn't have known the context because, of course, he thought it was Thomas Jefferson, who I'm sure at some point had a call to say something similar, but just didn't. And what made it famous was his use, again, in defense of British soldiers charged with murder in the Boston Massacre. I think that's actually well worth noting and all of that. Let's see. I don't know which two words he omitted from the quote, but that seems all right. I don't know whether Dale in this piece gives any attention to the fact that Cawthorn's on record as saying that he didn't even really hire any legislative aides for his office. He's built his office, as he says, around communications, which is, we've mentioned it in the past before, and I think that there's a lot of offices that are sort of built more like that these days, which is just a growing trend for Republicans in general, and actually relates a little bit to something that Patrick Snyder sent over by way of another thread to read through. Just the way Republicans, up-and-coming Republicans, approach government service like this. He's got no interest in legislating while serving in the legislature. He's there as a messaging guy. All his bills are messaging bills, except he doesn't have any bills. You get the idea. Well, at any rate, that carries us almost all the way up to the break, but let's see if we can share one or two others of his various historical mistakes before exiting for the break. There's one following this one about the Emancipation Proclamation. So, topical, given that it was just Juneteenth. In an interview last November with the publication Jewish Insider, that must have been a contentious interview, while attending an orientation in Washington for new members of the House, Cawthorn said, "I'm a lover of history, so it's incredible to be in a place where we had the vote to decide to have the Emancipation Proclamation." Ah, yes, right. Well, it was, of course, a proclamation and not a bill. Congress didn't have anything to do with that. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning. I have good news to report. Many more listeners like you are making critical contributions that keep our show on the air. Makes good sense, of course, and patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple. Now you can make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. Maybe you'd like to thank us for helping keep you sane during the Trump era. Maybe you're looking forward to in-depth explanations of what's going on in the Biden administration. Whatever it is that keeps you listening, we need your help to keep bringing it to you. And hey, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running with those options too. Thanks again, everyone, for all of your support. We literally could not do this without you. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here in Edwards Radio. Let's see. We were just in the middle of discussing his mistake, Madison Cawthorn's, that is, about the Emancipation Proclamation. Just getting excited about being in Congress, and I guess you can't blame him for that, although he had no business being there, but that would just make it more exciting, right? Especially if you thought you were a history buff, even if you really weren't. I'm a lover of history, so it's incredible to be in a place where we had the vote to decide to have, that's interesting, the Emancipation Proclamation. President Abraham Lincoln, Daniel Dale then goes on to note, made his own decision to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. There was no congressional vote to decide whether to have the proclamation, or anything of the sort, really. It is true that nearly 3 months after Lincoln issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which declared that all slaves in states still in rebellion, against the U.S. would be free on January 1st, 1863, the House passed a non-binding resolution expressing its support for the proclamation. There was that, but I doubt that that's what he was referring to. Wouldn't that be interesting? I'm a lover of history, so it's incredible to be in the place where the House, 3 months after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued by President Lincoln, passed a non-binding resolution expressing general support for that proclamation. How incredible. And, of course, a real history buff might be able to point to, I don't know, moments in history where the Congress took an actual vote on something. Could have been the vote to declare war on, the Axis powers of World War II. I don't know, really. Just any number of things that they could have done instead of that one. But, of course, he was looking, I'm sure, to placate others, probably people he would now deride as the forces of political correctness, by throwing a bone to people that he knows nothing about and cares nothing about. Who would object to my celebrating the Emancipation Proclamation? Well, we don't, of course. But, yeah, as far as history goes, I don't know what to tell you. Read it. There's more. James Madison figures in the next piece here in a speech to the Republican National Convention last August. And why would they care about accuracy? Cawthorn invoked American history, and that's in scare quotes, as evidence that, quote, young people can change the world. Well, sure. He said his personal favorite, James Madison, was just 25 years old when he did a lot of things, and he was very young, that's true. Just 25 years old when he signed the Declaration of Independence. Madison, of course, did not sign the Declaration of Independence. He's actually not there, and probably because he was too young, as a matter of fact, and just wasn't an accomplished figure at that point, not accomplished enough to be sent as a delegate to the Continental Congress that considered the Declaration of Independence. After Cawthorn's claim was fact-checked as false, and I mean, it doesn't take much. It's an interesting thing, like fact-check that. I'm not sure. Maybe he did sign the Declaration of Independence. Most people probably wouldn't be sure, but all right. I mean, honestly, I guess if you're like a lover of history, you would probably be sure off the top of your head. But after the claim was fact-checked as false, he tweeted that he had ad-libbed that line and meant to say that James Madison was 25 when the Declaration was signed, which is just not really an awfully interesting, historical fact. I mean, it's interesting that he was young at the Constitutional Convention some years later, that's true. But I mean, I was, a couple months old when they landed on the moon, but that doesn't mean I've had anything to do with it. But all right, there you have it. He added in a second tweet, after speaking all of that truth, I was afraid the fact checkers were going to get bored. I wanted to give them something to do. Yeah, sure. Okay. I meant that. That's why I did it. I did it on purpose, you see. Just to test everybody. Sure. Okay. Well, that's just him being embarrassed. There's more. One more, anyway. We'll offer one more before we exit from this and get on to something more serious. Washington and Lincoln figure in the next one. By the way, for a history buff, he's really calling out all the real obscure ones, isn't he? Washington, Lincoln, Madison, Jefferson, Adams, although he didn't know it was actually John Adams. So he's a history buff of some very specific kinds of history, some Schoolhouse Rock history, I guess. Cawthorn made additional errors in the same paragraph in that speech, though. That's an interesting observation, right? He had, after having told people in his tweet, I put that mistake in there on purpose. I was afraid the fact checkers were going to get bored. But he missed this other one that he accidentally did. He said George Washington was 21 when he received his first military commission. Now that's interesting because he made the mistake in the wrong direction. In fact, Washington was 20 in 1752 when he was named a major and adjutant in the Virginia Colonial Militia. Cawthorn also said Abe Lincoln, 22 when he first ran for office. Slightly off, but in the other direction, the direction you expected. Lincoln was 23 when he publicly announced for his first run for the Illinois legislature, and in which he was defeated in that race, 1832 race. Incidentally, then President Donald Trump got Lincoln's age right in a speech in 2017, because he actually outsourced it to someone else. Someone check and get me the right age. Saying, our first Republican president, Abraham Lincoln, ran his first campaign for public office in 1832 when he was only 23 years old. Cawthorn's office did not respond to a request for comment for this article, nor would they. They were mostly about communicating falsehoods to unsuspecting people, not correcting the record to fact checkers. They weren't going to do it. Okay, But there you go. And as somebody else pointed out, for having hired his staff for communications, you'd think that, maybe one of them would check his facts before they put him in those speeches and let him embarrass himself. But I guess not. They were busy. They're all still busy editing the tree punching video into something useful, I guess. All right, let's see. Some other items worth noting. I will read you the Huff Post. I almost called it the Huffington Post, but it's not. The story from end of last week. It was covered, of course, on the front page of Daily Kos, but I happened to catch this one first and grabbed it, and then I thought, why clutter up Pocket with too many articles about it? Well, this one will turn to Ryan Riley, who's been following the situation closely enough that we feel like we'll give him his star turn here. DOJ sues Georgia and says that the Republican-backed restrictions unlawfully targeting black voters are the issue. Their new restrictive voting laws down there, remember, passed with the encouragement of one-time, maybe sort of almost kind of could have been a hero, Brad Raffensperger, the Secretary of State. The Justice Department has made its first move against one of the voting laws passed in the wake of Donald Trump's lies about the 2020 election. The Justice Department sued the state of Georgia on Friday over a restrictive voting law passed in response to former President Donald Trump's lies about mass voter fraud in the 2020 election. The lawsuit alleges that the Georgia law was enacted with the purpose of denying or abridging the rights of black voters in the state. The Justice Department says Georgia's law was passed through a rushed process that departed from normal procedure and contained provisions including limits on drop boxes for absentee ballots and on providing food and water to voters waiting in long lines that were passed with unlawful discriminatory intent. Remember when that used to count in deciding the legality and constitutionality of, well, say, for instance, as we were discussing yesterday, presidential actions. Well, it can count against you in a state legislature as well. The Georgia legislature enacted the law with knowledge of the disproportionate effect that these provisions would have on black voters' ability to participate in the political process on an equal basis with white voters, the suit says. That's what the Department of Justice and their Voting Rights Division is supposed to be doing. So, good for them. The complaint noted that an overall rise in black political success in recent years in Georgia occurred against the backdrop of virulent racial appeals, including racist robocalls aimed at Stacey Abrams. The lawsuit also points to anti-Semitic attacks on now Senator John Ossoff and racist attacks on now Senator Raphael Warnock. One phone caller threatened to behead Reverend Warnock and referred to the church at which he is pastor, Ebenezer Baptist, the church where Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. once preached. That was his regular church. It makes it sound like he only was there once, to say it that way. But that was my own mistaken wording for it. Anyway, so one robocall threatening to behead Reverend Warnock and, referring to him and the church using a vile racist epithet. You can imagine what it might have been. The church had to filter comments on its social media pages given the significant number of racist comments relating to Reverend Warnock's candidacy, the Justice Department lawsuit states. Though the lawsuit doesn't name him, the Justice Department also points to an event, an event in which former Senator David Perdue mispronounced and mocked the pronunciation of then Senator Kamala Harris's first name during a campaign event, despite having been her Senate colleague for 4 years. It's a small club. Anyway, despite the fact that claims about mass fraud in the election have been debunked, the lawsuit said, white state legislators persistently relied on these debunked allegations of voter fraud to justify their enactment of SB 202, the law in question, even after being warned by other legislators about the disproportionately negative effects the bill would have on black Georgians' ability to cast ballots. That, of course, being the point. The lawsuit is being filed 8 years to the day after the Supreme Court, in a majority opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, struck down key provisions of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Those provisions required states with a history of racist voting laws, and they are one, to get pre-clearance from the federal government before implementing new voting laws. 3 longtime voting rights advocates, Associate Attorney General Vanita Gupta, Assistant Attorney General Kristen Clark, and Principal Deputy Assistant Attorney General Pam Carlin, now hold key positions at the Justice Department. That's how something like this comes about. Attorney General Merrick Garland said earlier this month that the Biden administration would rededicate the resources of the Department of Justice to a critical part of its original mission, enforcing federal law to protect the franchise for all eligible voters. The department plans to hire additional staff to work on voting rights cases, Garland said. The department would double its staff within 30 days. There are many things open to debate in America, Garland said, but the right of all eligible citizens to vote is not one of them. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, the right from which all other rights ultimately flow. And that seems a better statement of things than the way the gun enthusiasts put it, which is that it is gun rights from which all other rights ultimately flow, and not a formulation we favor here on the show or in reality, for that matter. But good news, one of the few items of really good news coming out of the Department of Justice at the moment. Glad to see that happening, even though I think they may be misguided in their approach to so many other things that they're doing now. All right, let's see. Where were we with all this? Oh, first of all, a comment on the Rex Tillerson tweet from earlier. Don Hammond, Blue State Don, on Twitter, saying Tillerson took the job at State to put the joint Exxon-Rosneft Arctic oil drilling project, stalled by Obama's Ukraine sanctions on Russia, back on track. He failed, and eventually Exxon itself failed on the project. That is a good point, a great observation. Glad to add that to the roundup. I'm going to bookmark that so that I can share it with you. And there's a CNBC report from the time about that deal backing that up. That is interesting. That is another point in his tragic arc, to have blown up his entire career and destroyed whatever legacy he thought he was going to have in exchange for the promise of putting that deal back on track and still not being able to do it, even with a favorable administration in place. I don't know whose failure that speaks to most, his or Donald Trump's. All right, let's see. Oh, something we'll have to discuss probably on Thursday when we're back on the air live. And Greg is with us, just sort of noting for the record in pandemic news today, with the Delta variant now surging here in the United States and around the world. I did see yesterday that the World Health Organization was recommending that even the vaccinated among us mask up again. And the CDC was pretty much dragging its feet. They still have lots of work to do convincing people, even if they're convincible, that the vaccines are effective and that it's worth getting them, and that you can regain a measure of freedom in society by, you can regain that freedom safely by getting yourself vaccinated. Of course, as we figured might be the case, many people just figured out I can just simply take that freedom and not get vaccinated and just pretend that I am, because there's no way for anybody to tell. And so the social shaming that went along with going about unmasked is gone. So I will just avail myself of that and go about unmasked. And of course, we also, spent a lot of capital convincing the vaccinated that it really doesn't even matter for their purposes, and that they ought not to fret too much, or at least not waste any energy worrying about how they would police non-compliance by the unvaccinated and simply accept that they were protected, and those who were unvaccinated and wanted to risk their own health could go ahead and do so. There was nothing that they could do that would affect the health of those who have been vaccinated. And that all gets thrown into doubt now when World Health Organization, or eventually the CDC, if they opt to go that route, reminds everybody, well, this new variant, much more transmissible, lots to worry about with it, and we really ought to do everything we can to stamp out transmission of it before it catches on here or gets worse here or develops into something even worse than the Delta variant itself here or anywhere in the world. And so you ought to mask back up. But yeah, it's going to be extremely difficult to get Americans back to masking. However, some places are trying it. And this is just a continuation of the big divide in how we approach public health in the various states where they elect Republicans versus Democrats for their governors. In California, we are informed here, a tweet from Eric Feigl-Ding, who we frequently quote on the show, with the Delta variant now surging almost 50% of all COVID-19, I guess nationwide, Los Angeles County now, quote, strongly recommends everyone, including folks fully vaccinated, to wear masks indoors to curb the Delta variant, especially when you don't know everyone's vaccination status. So, I mean, it still stands, I guess, that the vaccinated are mostly, anyway, protected from contracting and hopefully transmitting the virus as well. The Delta variant, much more easy to transmit, true, but even if it manages to break through in someone vaccinated, we're still assured that they are, generally speaking, mostly protected from any real prospect of severe illness, hospitalization, and death. And that's great. But, yeah, I'm starting to wonder how they would deal with something like this and how they'll convince people to mask back up if they're at the same time telling them that, there's nothing to worry about if you've been vaccinated. And I don't know how motivated people who are fully vaccinated are going to be to protect the purposefully unvaccinated at this point. But that too remains to be seen, and I guess we'll talk a little bit more about that on Thursday when there's somebody with more expertise on hand to discuss exactly what's going on and what's worth trying and what's not. All right. Let's see. Other items worth discussing here today. This one I think needs more context, so we'll flip back out of this and back into Pocket. Maybe as a setup for discussion with Joan later on, we can check into the supposed reemergence of Infrastructure Week and read the Washington Post's Monkey Cage piece, thanks to Sarah Binder, from yesterday, under the intriguing title of Do We Have an Infrastructure Deal? That's an important question for Infrastructure Week, don't you think? 4 takeaways on what Democrats and Republicans are up to and why it's a big deal. That's the subheader for this piece. Let's read on. After weeks of negotiating, President Biden has said yes to an infrastructure approach crafted by a bipartisan gang of centrist senators and supported by Democratic Party leaders, not Republican leaders, that would plow more than $1 trillion into the nation's physical infrastructure. If the plan passes, Biden would be able to make a large down payment on his campaign promise to fix crumbling roads and bridges, expand rural access to broadband, and invest in clean energy, transit, and other programs. But beware, potholes lie ahead. Haha, potholes. Last week, 5 Republican and 5 Democratic senators, backed by an additional 6 Republican and 5 Democratic senators. Why not just simply say then that it is 11 Republican senators and 10 Democratic senators? I don't know why you separate it this way into 2 tiers. Anyway, this group appeared with the president to unveil the agreement. I guess 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats appeared with the president, but 6 other Republicans, and 5 other Democratic senators who weren't present expressed support for it. I guess that's what's going on here. But Biden turned heads later that day. Remember this? It's already kind of a non-factor, but Biden turned heads later that day when he vowed he would only sign the bipartisan plan into law if Congress simultaneously sends him a bill crafted separately by the Democrats to shore up the nation's social infrastructure. Although I suspect what he really meant in that, by the way, was I'll only sign it as long as there is a bill that addresses that. Now, if it's addressed by Democrats and Democrats only, that is to say passed, say, via reconciliation or some other process that avoids the filibuster that was yet to be invented, then he would sign that. Of course, I guess if there was bipartisan cooperation on this second bill, he would sign that too. It's not that he's insisting that it be done by only Democrats. He's just being realistic and guessing that that's the only way it would happen. So he links the 2 bills. The second bill would be what's called a reconciliation bill, Sarah reminds us, a bill able to pass the Senate with only Democratic votes. That doesn't explain what it is. And I'm quite surprised that Sarah Binder chooses to present it this way, but I don't know. For whatever reason, this is how she chooses to do it, in elementary terms only. Biden watered down that threat over the weekend, but House Speaker Nancy Pelosi has made clear that there isn't going to be a bipartisan bill unless there's a reconciliation bill. Republicans knew Democrats were working on a reconciliation bill, but cried foul when Biden explicitly linked passage of the 2. That led GOP lawmakers to threaten to blow up the deal and set the White House scrambling to get the plan back on track. Here's what you need to know, although I always hate that formulation, and I am beginning to suspect that this is less than you and I really need to know about this thing. But first, it's a framework, not a deal. The agreement is a framework, not an actual legislative bill. The gang identified programs that such a bill would fund over the next 8 years and suggested more than $500 billion of new spending not previously authorized by Congress. Producing an actual bill takes time. Lawmakers and staff must translate the agreement into legislative text, the details of which legislators could contest. What's more, budget laws require the Congressional Budget Office to estimate a bill's costs. Because the Senate gang committed to offset new spending, some senators' votes may turn on how the CBO scores the bill's proposals for raising revenue. Not all the approaches suggested in the agreement, such as auctioning off the 5G spectrum or making it a priority to collect unpaid back taxes, are likely to yield the revenue needed. Why? I'm sorry that I was launching into reading a promo for another article. We need to skip that and go instead to reconciliation is far off too. To write a reconciliation bill, which would be protected from a Senate filibuster and thus could pass with only Democratic votes, the House and Senate must first agree to a budget resolution that sets spending, revenue, and debt targets for the coming fiscal year. The budget resolution also instructs congressional committees to draft proposals that lie within their turf. By the way, just point of clarification, yes, you can go forward with appropriations bills even if you don't have a budget resolution in place. But remember again that it is in the budget resolution that reconciliation instructions are issued. That is what clears the path procedurally for allowing the Senate to adopt reconciliation legislation later and avoid the filibuster. So without a budget resolution, you just can't start the reconciliation process. So that has to happen first. Democratic chairs of the House and Senate budget committees are discussing the parameters of the resolution, but they have not yet agreed. After the chambers agree on the resolution, work can begin on the reconciliation bill later on. Budget laws allow for nearly unlimited Senate amendments to both bills, that is to say, both the budget resolution and the reconciliation bill or bills. which means that measures will consume days of floor time in summer when the Senate is usually in recess. Next up, Democrats divided. It's a must include for every article. With slim majorities and disagreements within the party, Democratic leaders must walk a tightrope to secure majorities for both bills. In both chambers, more liberal Democrats favor a reconciliation bill focused on social programs financed by tax increases on corporations and the wealthy. With an election year looming and Democratic control at risk, they fear that the president and Democratic leaders might give up on a reconciliation bill once they pass the bipartisan plan. So progressives threaten to oppose any bipartisan plan that does not invest in social infrastructure such as child care, education, health, and climate. At the same time, more moderate Democrats favor a less costly bipartisan package to appeal to more moderate voters back home and to show that they can work across party lines. What's more, 2 House Democrats have signaled that they're uneasy with an expensive reconciliation bill, and pivotal Democratic senators, particularly Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, have not yet committed to voting for the Democrats-only reconciliation bill, though Manchin has offered an outline of what he would support. By exploiting procedural advantages, especially the House Speaker's influence over the timing and makeup of what goes to the floor, Democratic leaders aim to make voting for both bills palatable to the factions. House and Senate Democratic leaders have agreed to pass the bipartisan bill only if they can also move forward with the partisan reconciliation bill, cutting into the leverage that Manchin and Sinema have enjoyed in a 50-50 Senate. Leaders are betting that the condition will entice both factions to vote for both measures. Shaking hands on the bipartisan deal might be just the sweetener Manchin and Sinema need to be able to vote for reconciliation. Well, that's the basics of it. There's still one more section. We'll address that after a brief 1-minute break and then move on. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. Let's continue with Sarah Binder's pieces. Just a little bit left. And so far, I guess I expected more out of a Sarah Binder piece, but occasionally the basics, primers on the basics are welcome too, although I thought we might get a little bit more out of the monkey cage on this one than we actually got. I think this is largely a review, but it's a good setup for talking with Joan later on, since infrastructure will almost certainly be a part of that discussion. Finally, this last section entitled Republicans, Too Clever by Half. It's difficult to imagine Republicans as clever at all, but let's see what she has to say. Bipartisan cooperation in policymaking is unusual when the opposition party thinks that it has a chance to win back control of Congress. Usually, minority parties try to show their differences from the party in power so that voters see what's at stake in the next election. But this time, almost a dozen Republicans have shown interest in cooperating, and at least so far, Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell has not torpedoed the deal, although I think this was written before he essentially torpedoed the deal, or at least tried to. Why? First, spending on physical infrastructure is popular. It usually is. Second, at least one Republican thought cooperating on a bipartisan agreement could diminish Democrats' appetite for abolishing the filibuster. Third, Republicans saw a chance to fracture divided Democrats. In this case, Republicans believed adopting a bipartisan bill could undermine passage of reconciliation. Democrats' move to yoke the bills together undermines that GOP strategy. Republican votes for the hard infrastructure bill might not lessen Democrats' support for reconciliation, so just outright might not work. And walking away from the deal makes it more likely that both that the Republicans will be blamed for its failure and that a reconciliation bill would pass. Are Republicans willing to accept a substantively robust bipartisan deal, even if the optics work in Democrats' political favor? Stay tuned. All right, well, the more intricate stuff, I guess, will be saved for later. We'll see whether she returns and writes any of it. So, I don't know. wasn't all that we usually get from Sarah Binder, but look, sometimes you gotta do the basics and or take a day off from time to time. Let's see. Several other stories of longer form that I really would like to share with you, but I have a couple other things that I want to get to. Maybe what we can do here is we'll turn for now to this New York Times piece that plays off of the infrastructure intro here. An opinion piece, a guest essay in New York Times by Brian Highsmith, who it's noted here. Highsmith is a senior researcher at Yale Law School's Arthur Lyman Center for Public Interest Law. He was a tax policy advisor on President Barack Obama's National Economic Council. And this seemed like an interesting inquiry, an interesting angle on things. Republicans want you, not the rich, to pay for infrastructure. And I guess that might become a stumbling block later on. And for those of you who are listening to the show and are rich, well, good luck to you, I guess. You don't get to pay for all that fun infrastructure stuff under the Republican plan. How interesting. And by the way, you should send a ton of all of that huge pile of cash you're sitting on to us. How about that? And also to Netroots Radio and all the other fun people who make programming possible, etc., etc. That's a terrible pitch for all these things. But anyway, I would imagine that those of you, I guess, if listening, who happen to be describable as rich are splitting up that money and sending it out the door already anyway. So, that reminds me. As a matter of fact, that's a good reminder, too. Something I haven't remembered to get to. One other contributor who has bumped up their contribution, I know everyone likes to get acknowledged when they do this, back on the 18th. So it's been, it's already 11 days late in acknowledging the boosted contribution from John Cowgill. Cowgill, is it? It's not like I need more cowgill, like that kind of thing, or it could be soft G. There's two L's at the end of the name, so had it been just one, we could have thought it could be cow gel. I don't know what kind of gels the cows are using these days, but thank you, John, and I am sorry for making fun of your name on top of all this. Didn't mean to do it that way, just my own self-consciousness about getting these names right. But thanks, John, for your boost, and everyone else, of course, who backs us, and will try and stay up to date when, better than 11 days late, when we acknowledge these things. All right, well, at any rate, we're speaking now directly to the rich, who are probably not listening to the program because, of course, we want to fleece them all and possibly eat them. So they tend to run away from these things. What is this about? Republicans want you, not the rich, to pay for infrastructure. Yes. Well, some of the propositions about how Republicans might come to agreement on an infrastructure bill shifts the burdens of paying for that infrastructure in ways that you should be aware of and possibly be interested in opposing. Again, according to Brian Highsmith, let's roll into the piece here. 21 senators, led by Rob Portman of Ohio, a Republican, announced a new outline agreement for an infrastructure package last week. By the way, what's the date line on this? This is from June 23rd, middle of last week. So the week before, the Republicans outlined this new agreement. Disagreement over tax changes derailed previous talks, but this bipartisan group claimed to have identified a set of proposed financing sources that could pay for new spending, quote, without raising taxes. And that's in scare quotes for a number of reasons, I'm sure. Reportedly, the largest among those was $315 billion from alternative financing schemes known as public-private partnerships. That always raises an eyebrow for our groups here. The legislators are jumping through these hoops in the first place because for the past 3 decades, this is a good backgrounder, the Republican Party has organized its agenda around an absolutist principle. No new taxes, ever. But despite the senators' insistence, these arrangements do not actually avoid extractive charges on residents, which is what taxes are. They just launder the new fees through private investors. How so? Rather than the government financing the rebuilding of roads and bridges that get you across town, you pay a private company operating in contract with the government, while policymakers pretend that they have avoided imposing new costs. Chief among these schemes that Republicans have identified are so-called user fees, like road tolls, and a new fee on vehicle miles traveled. The White House rejected such proposals as violating its own tax pledge, a promise not to increase taxes on families earning under $400,000 annually. As President Biden observed, if everything is paid for by a user fee, the burden falls on working class folks who are having trouble. In recent decades, state and local governments increasingly have turned to these funding arrangements, and unlike progressive taxes, user fees, whether addressed by public entities or by private firms contracted with the state, are not generally varied by ability to pay. They are imposed at a flat rate on the poorest and the wealthiest alike, assessed in proportion to their use of public infrastructure. These extractive revenue models condition access to critical goods and services on families' available resources. And unlike with consumer goods, people often have no choice but to use these spaces. In 2008, to avoid raising property taxes, Chicago famously leased its parking meter infrastructure to a group of private investors. Shortly after the asset sale, residents parking downtown were paying more than double the prior rates. The privatization of local public services can be observed in soaring school lunch debt, exorbitant charges for prison phone calls, and revenue-driven over-policing. Especially, I think we heard about that chiefly a couple of years ago from down in the St. Louis area. But it's happening everywhere, of course. And I did just read somewhere, was it Connecticut, perhaps, that eliminated charges at all for prison phone calls, or either drastically cut them or made prison phone communications free, which is a tremendously progressive thing to do and got next to zero attention, even here. But I don't even know whether I put a story on that aside. I'll have to make a note for myself. But of course, I've removed all writing implements from the area. But let's see if I can, I don't know, maybe I can scratch it out in blood. Prison phone calls. That's a lot of blood. All right. Well, we'll see whether we can get around to that. Otherwise, you can complain to me later if I don't come up with proof of that one. Should be relatively easy to uncover. Anyway, where were we with this? Yes. The end point of this shift can be observed in rural Tennessee. You ready for this one? Where several jurisdictions instructed firefighters not to respond to emergencies without first confirming that occupants have paid an annual service fee. If they have not, city responders stand aside and let the homes burn to the ground. I believe we've heard of something like this before, and I don't know whether it was in Tennessee. I think that's entirely possible that's actually what we heard. Let me see. I'm going to open up the link there and see if it's an old story. Yes, it is. Okay, this goes back to October 2010. So entirely possible that we may have discussed this before, and this is the actual example that we may have used. Wow. Well, that's going back a ways. By the way, even if you have paid, isn't there some possibility that your home will have sustained more damage because the firefighters had to spend time that they were supposed to spend racing to your rescue, instead checking the databases first before they go? I'm just curious about that. Anyway, the lesson is clear. Flat rate, user-funded structures privatize social risks while shielding wealth from productive public use. It's actually a less transparent expression of it than I was expecting after that, because the lesson was clear, but I get you. This underlying dynamic does not change when such fees are imposed by unaccountable private investors rather than the state. Some particular fees, including those for street parking and congestion pricing schemes, are often justified as internalizing public costs of socially deleterious behavior, analogous to sin taxes assessed on alcohol and tobacco. But if the primary motivation is to shape individual decisions, this goal arguably is undermined by the flat rate design of most fees, which may be debilitating for poor families, but are hardly noticed by the wealthy. It should not be overlooked that transportation fees recently helped catalyze powerful social movements for tax fairness in several other countries. Okay, good. I think it has gone without notice here so far and has been overlooked, so let's see. What's this about? In Chile, for example, a 4% increase in subway fares inspired large-scale street protests in 2019, prompting the president to cancel the hike, call for a new higher tax bracket for top incomes, and initiate a referendum on the country's anti-democratic constitution. Well, I mean, I'd be against that. I don't even know where to start with that. But okay, it's Chile. I don't know that much about it. At the same time, a fuel increase proposed by President Emmanuel Macron of France spurred the Yellow Vest protests. Remember those? They were hot for a while. That called for the reintroduction of a recently repealed wealth tax, a better alternative to funding mechanisms that burden consumers is to make public goods available to all who wish to use them, funded through progressive taxes and provided free at the point of consumption. This vision lives in a proposal from a Boston City Council member, Michelle Wu, to create a completely free city transit system. It also is reflected in the current organizing, led in California by the Debt-Free Justice Coalition, to abolish fees assessed on people who have contact with the criminal justice system. All right, two things, one and then two or more steps removed from transportation funding, or direct transportation funding, but pretty good. I guess I should say highway funding. I mean, mass transit is, of course, transport funding. As negotiations continue, we can learn from the harmful consequences brought about by the privatization of local public goods and opt instead for an inclusive public infrastructure that is available and affordable to everyone. It's a good point to cut through the whole thing and clarify it just a little bit more. What's at stake here is, of course, paying for infrastructure through essentially, I mean, to simplify it, a toll fee structure. You want to build more roads? Well, you can either have the government pay for it, which is anathema to Republicans, who are apparently essential for bringing together a bipartisan deal, or you can pretend that it's being built without raising taxes, quote unquote raising taxes, by having somebody else pay for it, but authorizing them to collect the money on the back end in form of tolls from everyone who uses it. And so the end result is more money comes out of your pocket anyway. But the government can say, I didn't do it. It wasn't me. I didn't ask you for the money up front or take it from you through taxes. I simply authorized someone else to take it from you in so-called user fees. For you, who has the empty pocket, it doesn't matter. The money is gone. But it does, in fact, matter because sometimes the private entities authorized to take that money out of your pocket take much more than a government might otherwise take. And it doesn't all come out in the wash, and it ends up being worse, and it ends up with the government owning less for its trouble anyway, if not for its money, than it would have otherwise. So an important piece of the puzzle. And I'm sure something we'll discuss a little bit with Joan when she joins us in a little bit. I want to change directions slightly anyway and throw another voice into the mix here. You remember our friend from Daily Kos, Liberal Thinking, Rich at Liberal Thinking. See, now here, the other kind of Rich listening to the program, discussing a slightly different take on things, but I think we opened the door when we were looking at, say, Michelle Wu's proposal that Boston fully fund its public transit system such that it be free to all users. That's sort of a big departure from the way we traditionally do things. And I guess the excitement over the recent Democratic primary in the New York mayoral race, some excitement anyway, there's a minimal level of excitement created by the participation of Andrew Yang in the primary, simply because the name recognition that he had generated by running for president on the universal basic income platform. And Rich takes a crack at a proposal here. I'll roll his tape for you. It's not very long, but I'll get through it and I'll point you to his post about it on Daily Kos, which he'll describe how you can find it, of course, but takes another crack at the universal basic income idea, but also, I think, does so in a different and interesting way. Why don't we roll it and listen in and see what you think.
Hi, David. This is Rich, also known as Liberal Thinking. I represent a strong progressive view within the Democratic Party, and you can find my articles promoting progressive values in the All Daily Kos Progressives group on dailykos.com. In passing the American Rescue Plan, Democrats dropped a provision for increasing the minimum wage because they couldn't get agreement to override the Senate parliamentarian on including it in reconciliation. But a minimum wage is not the only way to reach the goal of lifting workers out of poverty. Democrats should add a provision for a weekly payment to all working-age Americans when they finalize the next reconciliation bill. This payment is called an equality payment because it is an equal amount paid to all working-age adults regardless of their gender, heritage, or circumstances. For someone earning minimum wage, this payment would be just like getting an increase in their hourly wage. For example, for a person who works 40 hours per week at the federal minimum wage, $7.25 an hour, an equality payment of $100 a week would be like an increase of $2.50 in the minimum wage. It would be like boosting the federal minimum wage to $9.75 an hour. And remember, not everyone is subject to minimum wage. An increase in the minimum wage would leave out gig workers, but an equality payment would not. A minimum wage would leave out stay-at-home parents, while an equality payment would not. This proposal is strictly about money taken in and money paid out by the federal government and its effect on the federal deficit. Therefore, it fits completely within the rules for reconciliation. That means it could be passed if all Senate Democrats agreed, without support from a single Republican. While we might not see this proposal pass Congress immediately, promoting it puts pressure on Congress to raise the minimum wage. Senators can no longer point to the filibuster and blame Republicans for holding up this increase. Democrats in Congress will have to answer to the voters on their own why they support or oppose helping working Americans make ends meet. You can find details about equality payments in the article Minimum Income is Within Our Reach on dailykos.com, along with other posts by Liberal Thinking in the All Daily Kos Progressives group. Join our group and make your own contributions. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you, David, for posting the sound clip for your listeners. I hope it supports your great work to get information out about democratic causes and how our government works. Thank you.
I hope so. And boy, my work is great, isn't that? Thanks very much, Rich. That's an interesting thought, too. And I liked the linkage, to the fight over the minimum wage. It doesn't, of course, bring us up to certainly not to the $15 that we were talking about for boosting the minimum wage. But as he pointed out, that has some shortcomings as well. You could, of course, boost the size of your proposed equality payment or whatever it is that you decided to term it. But yes, some good points made about how even boosting the minimum wage, whether you boost it to 10, 15, 20, whatever it is, dollars an hour, there's a lot of people that get missed by that. And this, I think, was much more akin to the universal basic income idea, and an interesting one at that. And well worth considering. I don't know whether or not, well, you can never tell with these things, whether or not the entire mechanism fits entirely within reconciliation in the end. I mean, it's a good point in that it really is dealing only with budgetary issues in terms of making the payments, but in terms of, say, authorizing the payments or the mechanism through which the federal government would distribute these payments, the establishment of, I don't know whether you'd have to, I assume if you could make it work. I don't think it's actually unworkable. It might require some tinkering, though, and might require authorizing and it would be a good idea to do things this way anyway, regardless of reconciliation considerations. But we might have to authorize some existing bureaucracy, essentially, to make these disbursements. And I assume it could be through the IRS, and we could simply attach these things to tax filings, etc., so that we wouldn't, and that would minimize the problem of trying to get the thing authorized through reconciliation if we didn't have to build up any or authorize some new entity to track and make these payments, which, that would be a cost savings idea that would be worth considering anyway, but it also might help in getting things through reconciliation. But it's also very difficult to tell. In the end, once the details are all written out, there are just that many more places, stumbling blocks really, for Republicans to find and make objections under the reconciliation rules to some important element of that program. So it should never be a foregone conclusion that the Senate parliamentarian is going to go along. But, you go and you check. You don't give up because it's going to be a problem. Anything you propose is going to be a potential problem and is going to involve headache with the Senate parliamentarians. So that can't be the reason for not doing it. And, I think the chances are a lot better than certain other attempts. Although, the same argument was made about including the minimum wage under reconciliation. And it's really only about about revenues being affected in the end, but that's not the same view that the parliamentarian takes of it. So you're always on notice there and always cautioned before leaping into things to be remember to be appropriately pessimistic about your chances of getting past the parliamentarian. But yes, I thought an interesting proposition and one I hadn't heard anything about, and I like that it doubles back and makes a second attempt at a slightly lower level, but acknowledging, all right, well, we've missed the mark on the minimum wage and we mean to return to it, but we know that the filibuster stands in the way. Are there some incremental steps we might consider taking in the meantime? Of course, that leaves you subject to accusations of giving in to incrementalism, which a lot of bold progressives, for instance, and others who might otherwise have thrown in their lot with working on such a program in the All Daily Coast Progressives group would ordinarily disparage if it was someone else's work. But that, too, is a lesson in how government works and how these things actually tend to happen. And, well, sometimes it's best to take those additional incremental steps to the extent that they're helping people while you're working on things. That's got to win the approval of most progressives to begin with. Okay, so we're coming up to our break. The last segment in the show is when we often expect to hear from Joan. So I'm queuing up her appearance and just taking a quick look at what she's been writing about in the last couple of days to get some idea of where we might be going. We might need to, it's time for us to do this anyway, double back and consider what's going on with the Supreme Court. A few more decisions being issued in the last couple of days and some more yet to come. And I guess we'll get some warnings on what bad news to look out for. And, a story that I have not discussed to this point. Maybe it'll be on her slate of interesting stories. She's been writing about what Toyota has gotten itself into in the last couple of days in insisting that not only going back to funding Republican lawmakers who, well, essentially supported the insurrection back on January 6th and voted to invalidate or attempt to invalidate the electoral votes from various states with which they disagreed, but Toyota not only contributing to them, but defending their decision to do so and landing themselves in major PR trouble. That and more next.
Sup fam, it's your boy Darwin, aka Darwin_Darko, aka the most reasonable man in America, aka KITM's senior black correspondent. You might remember me from such recordings as Spacemen vs. Space Cadets and We Need to Talk About Joe Biden. Today, I want to bring you good news about that thing you've been struggling with. Do you suffer from giving too much of a damn? Do you turn on the series of tubes and find yourself outraged at the particular way some news organization strung some sentences together only to realize, nope, this is not some fictional hellscape? Well, guess what? You no longer have to accept the life of giving too much of a damn. You can do something about it, because even you, yes you, can be a show contributor. Now I know what you're thinking. Hey, Mr. Most Reasonable Man in America, I'm not some professional podcast talking guy. Don't worry about it. Do you have a smartphone or some other electronic recording device? Well, that's all you need. You too can have a segment where you can read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Fair warning though, side effects may include general punditry, having opinions and hot takes, getting stuff off your chest, and hearing your own voice. If your recording lasts longer than 5 to 7 minutes, please consult kagrox@gmail.com. That's KAGROX@gmail.com.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Joan McCarter is here with us, surviving the Pacific Northwest heat wave with added insulation in your attic. Good news. Always a good idea. Right, keeping you...
I can keep the upstairs at 75. I can keep the whole house at 75, and that's
a big relief considering it's, what'd you say, 105 outside now?
Not now, it will be.
Yes.
It will be.
It's only 103 now. Right. It's, yeah, how is it at night? What's it like? Is it just staying
It actually got
warm,
down to 69
overnight
at my house. But it's probably going to stay in the 70s. It broke on the west coast, the coast overnight. Cold front moved in, but the way the high pressure ridge is situated, it means it's going to lock in here for probably 10 days.
Oh, well, okay. Yeah.
And I don't know, we're not forecast to get the 115 kinds of temperatures that they saw on the coast, but 10 days over 100 is not going to be very much fun.
Yeah, right. Well, that's got to be something too, being at 105 in the day and in the 60s at night. And I mean, it's not freezing temperatures, but I guess watch out for all your reinforced concrete construction.
Oh boy!
Miami, I guess. So, all right. I don't think you have as many sinkhole problems as they do. That's a different issue.
We don't have sinkholes.
You're lucky for that.
That's good news.
All right. At least you don't think so. Who knows what the temperature could bring? Boy. All right. Well, 105. Not so. Is that? I assume record breaking or close to it?
No.
No.
Mm-mm.
Really? Okay.
I think 110 or 111.
All right. So,
I mean, for the days, yes, not all time.
Mm-hmm.
And what we're probably gonna do, Thursday might give us a little bit of a break, but what we'll probably do is break the record for consecutive days over 100.
Okay.
Whee!
Well, congratulations. You finally did it. All right. Well, hopefully you can stay cool there and, not suffer too much. And, extra insulation always a good idea. Well, with the cooler temperatures inside, you're comfortable and able to work. So that's good. What have you been able to do?
It's been a busy morning with the Supreme Court, which had 5 decisions to release this morning, released 3 of them.
Okay.
One's a patent case. I'm not really sure what it does.
Okay.
There's
Check
an
into that.
immigration case that is quite bad, and I expect we'll see Gabe write about it
Okay.
today.
Figure out what that's about.
And the third is a pipeline case, saying eminent domain may be invoked to lay pipeline in New Jersey.
Oh.
Well, that's probably not good either. Alito decided on the immigration case, which is whether asylum seekers are entitled to a bond hearing. Alito says no, and Alito, prevails. 6-3.
Okay. Well, we'll get a deeper dive on that probably later in the day. A patent case we're never likely to understand, but that might be okay.
Which means Voting Rights Act is not out, and the Voting Rights Act will survive for at least one more day.
Okay.
It's another campaign-related one. Americans for Prosperity. These are the last two to be decided.
Okay.
And this is another disclosure requirements.
Okay.
For the Kochs, Americans for Prosperity, and whether, I think, they must reveal donors, they or any nonprofits have to reveal donors despite threats of violence, and I'm not sure what that means. Let's see. At issue is a California mandate. I am reading a USA Today story that nonprofits disclose their top contributors to state regulators, to conservative groups, one tied to mega donor Charles Koch, says the state's requirement violates the Constitution by subjecting donors to threats of violence from political opponents and thereby chilling the exercise of their First Amendment rights. It'll be interesting. They heard this in April. It'd be really interesting when the political violence is coming from the people on Charles Koch's side,
right,
to see what the Supreme Court decides to do with it.
That will be interesting. And I've never really. I mean, I guess we have heard a little bit about that formulation, but usually, though, the courts should be on top of the idea that, well, we have these other things that say, you know, that are supposed to help us crack down on those threats of political violence. You're not supposed to be able to make them. It's not really unconstitutional to require disclosure because some other people could make threats. We're supposed to arrest the people who make threats so that you're free of that threat. We do deal with it in other sections of the law. It doesn't mean that I don't know. I mean, are things unconstitutional? Why isn't it unconstitutional to why is open carry not unconstitutional if somebody might shoot me with their open? Well, we're supposed to make that shooting illegal. You see, that's supposed to be my protection. I mean, it's a little late, but I see what you're getting at.
Because I'm dead,
right?
Maimed.
Yeah, but somehow the threat over political contributions that's supposed to rise to that level. I don't know. That seems like a tough one to get past a court, which will, I think, take some pride in enforcing the rest of the law. But you never know with these guys.
You never know with these guys.
Okay. Well,
they tend not to err on the side of transparency when it comes to political donations.
Right.
So I don't think the outcome there is really going to be in question. I don't know. We'll see.
All right. Well, we'll wait and see on that.
Unfortunately, I don't think the outcome in the voting rights case is really going to be in question either. This focuses on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. And it's a challenge to Arizona's laws that disallow, they make in fact a felony, ballot harvesting, which is what the right likes to call it. Political activists, community centers, all of these people who collect a group of ballots and deliver them. voted ballots, which is important in Arizona for Native American population, which on the reservations, very few of them have regular mail service.
Oh.
They don't have polling locations. These folks have to vote absentee, and it's impractical, to say the least, to drive the miles and miles and miles on terrible dirt roads for every individual person to deliver their ballot. So they're taken in groups usually. So that's one of the laws that was challenged. The other was tossing ballots that are voted in incorrect precincts have to be tossed. And Arizona has a habit, particularly in its largest counties, Maricopa and Pima, of moving precinct locations, polling locations around on a whim in predominantly Latino and communities of color. So these are the things that were challenged. They should be disallowed under Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which prevents states, localities from making specific elections actions that harm minority communities. The conservative justices all seemed pretty hostile to the DNC's arguments on Section 2 in the arguments on this case. So it's not looking good right now for the only part of the Voting Rights Act that basically exists.
Still survives, yeah. Okay, yeah. Well, yeah, that's worrisome, but is that expected then today or is
Thursday?
That waiting for tomorrow?
There were just these three decisions today, and the next decision day is Thursday, and it's going to be the Americans for Prosperity and Voting Rights Act.
Okay. All right. Well, that's on tap, and we'll wait on that one. I guess we'll be back for that one. I happen to be away from the desk tomorrow, so I didn't want to be gone while this was happening. But good. All right. We have to wait till Thursday anyway. Fine. Thanks for waiting, Supreme Court. I appreciate it.
And if I'm not busy writing,
yeah,
Thursday maybe I can join you to discuss it.
All right. Well, in that case, I hope you're not. So it would be nice to be able to have a special edition there. That reminds me, too, maybe if you could share that USA Today article that you were reading from, we can let everybody read that one, too. So send that along at some point.
Yes, I will send that to you now.
Hey, all right.
Tweet it at you. How's that?
Okay. Yes, I'll be on the lookout for that then. Thanks. And I'm just sort of combing through the rest of what you've been working on over the past couple of days, and I mentioned as a possibility, just because we haven't talked about it much, the Toyota business. And I noticed that you had written on that on Monday, and we haven't had a chance to discuss it. I don't know if that's high on your list or not.
It's not particularly high on my list.
Well, then you don't
it's kind of dumb of Toyota, though.
Yeah, it seemed like, weird.
To double down on the idea that they can give to whoever they want to give. And particularly when they're giving to Andy Biggs, who was fingered as one of the four sort of plotters of the January 6th insurrection.
Yeah, all right. Well, that would.
And Toyota put out this big statement. Well, we don't support the insurrection, and we don't give to these people, and blah 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 blah. But we still have every right to give. Interesting.
Yeah.
The other part of it that was interesting to me is that they're giving to so many Republicans, insurrectionist Republicans, who want to make it harder for them to sell their hybrid cars.
Yeah, that is an odd thing, and I guess they're hoping to change their minds by giving them a bunch of money, but I don't know. We'll see whether that works. But yeah, it was kind of odd to see them do this and to say. I think what I did read about it just briefly was it in their statement that they were saying, well, what's the big deal? People had some disagreement about whether or not we can't tell members of Congress that they can't vote to not to certify the Electoral College if that's what they believe. I mean, come on. Just sort of this weird.
We do not believe it is appropriate to judge members of Congress solely based on their votes on the electoral certification.
I mean, it really kind of is. But yeah, right. I think that's it calls into question whether they really understand at that office, whatever the Toyota PR office really understands what they're saying. I mean,
yeah,
I imagine they would find it appropriate
really
to judge them
because this is sedition, kinda.
Yeah, but it's inappropriate to judge. Just because people want to overthrow the government doesn't mean I can't help them do that.
The part of it that's most interesting to me is that the bulk of Toyota's manufacturing and activities here in the United States, their headquarters are in Texas, but the big places where they employ people are Kentucky sites. And just how much this has anything to do with Mitch McConnell is sort of curious to me.
Yeah, that would that's most likely. That's probably at the bottom of the explanation for it all, because it is an awfully stupid formulation. I've never heard anybody say anything quite like that, except I guess they imagine most people, if they're paying any attention at all, probably, I don't know whether they recognize the implications of saying, of discussing that. We're flexible on electoral college certification. Like, maybe we should vote for president, maybe we shouldn't. Yeah. It would be. We don't think we should stop giving to members of Congress just because they endorse dictatorship. Well, yeah. I do. I think that you probably should. Well, it's a freedom of conscience thing that we have. Maybe dictatorship would be great. We don't know for sure. All right.
And then they went on.
Position.
They said, based on our thorough review,
I guess they made
we decide against giving to some members who, through their statements and actions, undermine the legitimacy of our elections and institutions. And they gave money to Andy Biggs.
Yeah, so who are they ruling out?
Who is still undermining the results of the election, is still saying it was stolen and helped organize the insurrection. So I don't think that their review was all that thorough, to tell you the truth.
Yeah, well, I guess, I'd be interested in making a review of who they're giving to and just, I guess, comparing it to a list of incumbent Republicans and finding out, is there anybody that they decided was too hot to handle in this? Maybe Marjorie Taylor Greene?
Apparently not. I mean, they gave to 37 of them.
All right, well, there's got to be somebody missing from the list. I'd just be curious as to who that is, and whether it's more about what they have or haven't said about the insurrection, or their respect for democracy, or it was probably better explained by Toyota facilities in their districts than anything else. They're just saying,
I would assume.
We don't.
It's hard to say.
Our issue.
Wanting to keep, because they do put out a lot of pickups, so maybe they're trying to make sure that their pickup loving customer base is intact.
Maybe,
which is not a very nice thing. I mean,
it is their business.
I don't mean to brush all pickup owners with that broad brush.
Just Toyota ones.
Yeah. In fact, I had a really nice surprise a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah?
When my contractor neighbor, who has like an ATV and 2 pickups and a sports car, and I made assumptions, and I made the wrong assumptions. He's had a permanent U.S. flag flying. He added a pride flag a couple of weeks ago.
Well, there you go. So yeah, you weren't guessing that? Okay.
Made my safe bubble here in my neighborhood just a little bit bigger.
Okay. Well, that's nice. Plus, he can haul mulch for you if necessary. So,
right.
That's good. All right. Well, yeah, I wonder how much crossover there is. The Toyota, I wouldn't, I guess if we're painting with the broad brush, I wouldn't guess the Toyota pickup drivers are the same people that they're worried about or luring back in with their contributions to the insurrectionists. I would guess that they would, for the most part, try and make themselves obvious as Ford and Chevy pickup drivers, but you never know. And Toyota makes...
And I think basically they're just, they're really just not paying that much
popular
attention.
Probably not.
They gave to these people, so they're going to keep giving to these people and somehow feel that there won't be backlash or that it doesn't really make a difference to them. I think they're going to hear otherwise. We'll see.
Well, they'll hear a lot about it. It's been a very popular discussion point, but a lot of people, it's difficult. You can't be super flexible about the car you may already have, car or truck, and you can make decisions about purchasing going forward, but generally speaking, it's not like boycotting a brand of cookies or something. It's a pretty major deal.
Right. It's a major purchase rather.
So
I think I'm going to stick with my Subaru.
Well, yeah, you could do that. That's easy enough. They don't make a pickup, but that's fine. There's plenty of other things that Toyota makes that appeal, and we'll see what the kind of impact that has on things. Anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting.
Electric vehicles.
Yeah,
and giving to the people who want to punish drivers of electric vehicles, which I just don't understand.
Is that still floating as part of the infrastructure ideas?
That's actually not going to end up in the infrastructure bill, probably. Biden has said no to electrical vehicle driver fees several times, so it looks like that's not going to happen at the federal level. There are plenty happening at the state levels, but not at the federal level.
Okay. Well, good. Let's see.
The bipartisan bill is actually going to pass anyway, but just what ifs? It's not going to happen.
Okay.
The electrical vehicle fees isn't going to happen. We don't know yet whether a wholesale sell-off of public assets to the highest bidder, old infrastructure, is going to happen or not. That's one of the big ideas for raising revenue in this bipartisan plan.
Yes, we were just talking
Sell
about
off the old stuff and have private companies tax you to use them.
Which usually works great. It keeps
to avoid
things,
saying we're raising taxes on you.
Right. Yeah, that was part of the discussion sort of leading into this, into our segment today. I don't know if there's more to add to it at this point. Maybe we just don't know much more, but yeah, the idea that, look, if it's money out of your pocket that you're worried about, and that's the chief objection that I always hear when it comes to taxation, it doesn't really matter who's removing the money or shouldn't, but I don't know.
It makes Biden's touting we are not raising taxes on people making less than $400,000 a year a little bit disingenuous.
Yeah,
when it's just a transfer of paying fees either to the federal government or to some hedge fund.
Yeah, it gives us an opportunity for him to say, well, I did make that promise, and if Republicans, I suppose, want to make it look like he's breaking the promise, they might press for these things. Of course, you could, if we were prepared to, press right back and say, that's interesting. You think that privatized infrastructure and privately collected user fees count as taxes for the purpose of breaking a no new tax pledge? Because I'll remember that.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see Republicans making that argument, though.
Okay. Well, that's fine if it means the defeat of that provision, but if it just means that the provision passes and Republicans whistle and look the other way, I don't know. But
I think it remains unlikely that this bill's going to go anywhere.
Oh, well,
to be honest. And we've seen some movement this morning. Joe Manchin on MSNBC indicated that, he still thinks the bipartisan bill is going to happen, but he has no problem at all with reconciliation.
Okay.
He's still raising a little bit of hell over the idea that it has to be $6 trillion. But he's okay with repealing or at least paring back on the 2017 tax breaks that the GOP put through. And in fact, has used that sort of as a talking point.
All right.
Republicans' refusal to cut into that. So Manchin is not being as terrible as he had been on any of this.
Okay.
So it's budget reconciliation is going to be how it happens.
All right.
Republicans are setting up the deal to say, we're not going to vote this because you reneged on it by doing budget reconciliation, even though we knew all along that that's what you were going to do. And in fact, we pushed you to do it so that we could try to split the Democrats. Infrastructure week.
Okay. Well, yeah, I don't think I was fully aware of just how much danger it was in of not passing. But it's a good development at least. The whole thing ends up backfiring in a way on Republicans who thought they could pry Manchin away. He would be much more reluctant to vote for a reconciliation bill, I guess, because of his stance on the filibuster. But it's just not the same thing. I don't know why they regarded it as the same. And he's been incoherent on the filibuster, so I guess it's possible that he might have been incoherent as between anything that bypasses the filibuster, anything that makes it possible to pass something with a simple majority. But he's never said that. He staked it out pretty clearly. He's never said that he was opposed to reconciliation as a procedure, even though, you could
not as a
pretend
procedure.
it was
Early on, he said after they did COVID relief by reconciliation that he was not going to vote for a infrastructure bill that was not bipartisan, that he was not going to vote for infrastructure if they did it just Democrats. And he can point to the fact that, we've had this whole bipartisan process, and so we tried it, and it didn't work, which is what it looks like he's working toward.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. Even that isn't so bad. I mean, I think that was said to be part of the plan all along. Well, we'll try it your way, and if it doesn't work, then will you think about something else? And I don't think he said that he wouldn't. He just simply said that my strong preference is for I'll only vote for something that's got a bipartisan process attached. Well, I guess you could say, well, the only reason we're here with the reconciliation bill of this size is that this is the end result of the bipartisan process from which the Republicans eventually boycotted, and we were stuck with this. This is something I would have proposed otherwise, but that was a bipartisan process. I asked them to join, and they said no. We both played in that process. That's all I meant. That'd be interesting. It didn't mean that we had to have votes for it from both sides of the aisle, because that would be crazy. I don't know. All right, well.
He's sort of taken the lead on being the problem for infrastructure. I don't know where this leaves cinema. Everybody said she's the leader of this effort along with Portman. She hasn't really said. I mean, she came out with her crazy, stupid, unserious op-ed about the filibuster, but she hasn't really said on reconciliation. So we'll see. By the way, filibuster is still a problem.
Yes. Still true. And, I mean, maybe this will get... it would be interesting if this led to an evolution of... the evolution that we all kind of had hoped in their... that we might one day see in their thinking, to see them say, all right, well, here you've tried the bipartisan process. I'm not opposed to reconciliation, so I'm going to do that. And then perhaps from that point, you might say, well, the lesson you learned from infrastructure and then landing on reconciliation... can you draw anything from that on your thoughts, your approach to voting rights, given that you weren't going to vote for any voting rights legislation that didn't have bipartisan support, but you've seen the process play out, and you've seen that in the states, Republicans are taking vicious advantage of purely partisan abilities to, the ability to legislate from a partisan perspective, and they're undermining voting rights piecemeal. Will you reconsider your approach to that?
Particularly in Arizona.
Yes. Right. Yeah. And one of you, I think, is from Arizona, maybe?
Right now, the governor's deciding whether he's signing legislation that takes takes power to oversee elections away from the Secretary of State, who happens to be a Democrat, and gives it to the Attorney General, who happens to be a Republican. The Republican who's defending the last 2 voter suppression bills at the Supreme Court. So
yeah, so I mean, it should be pretty obvious. But they continue to hold out. But I guess I'm hopeful that maybe Sinema's relative silence means that she's going to take Manchin's lead and let him. I don't know. I don't want to say too much about it being actually a hopeful sign that anybody's under Manchin's lead.
I know. Particularly when it comes to Sinema, because who knows what she's capable of doing.
I guess that's true. All right, well, so no real answers yet still on Infrastructure Week, which means next week is Infrastructure Week as well. So we'll be able to discuss it more.
Well, nobody's going to be in session, so.
Okay, yes. Really. Well, I forgot that. And your heat wave hopefully will have broken by that point. Well, you might be in the tail end of it still. We'll check and see. Yeah. All right. Well, good luck surviving it. Thanks for coming by today, and we'll remember to keep an eye on the Supreme Court through Thursday. And who knows? I guess if the writing gets done quickly, we might be able to look forward to an extra visit. That would be great too. Hopefully, it doesn't drive you nuts.
Best.
Okay. Well, fingers crossed for at least a clear result then. And we'll see you next week on Tuesday, if not sooner. Great. Thanks, and stay cool.
Good luck at the doctor.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
All right, well, hopefully I won't need too much luck, and just a routine thing, but, I guess it's always wise to hope for the best. You never know. Routine visits can lead to anything. Speaking of which, a routine visit with Justice Putnam is up next, and that could lead anywhere. So stay tuned and figure out the results of your testing.